You know, in life there are lots of occasions when surprisingly we come across something that takes us to a new place. Maybe it's a person, maybe it's a thing that we find, maybe it's some truth, maybe it's some connection, and we find ourselves saying, that's an aha experience. We've never seen it quite like that before, we've never known it like that before, we've never realised the impact that something like that would have on us. It's like, wow, that's really taken me by surprise. Or it might be that some insight brings such a deep sense of joy or release or relief, and we feel like we want to shout it from the mountaintops. Or it might be that at work we've unearthed some new discovery that will change the direction of our work or our research or maybe our life. Some years ago I read a book called Streets of Hope. And the subtitle was Finding God in St Kilda. It was written by Tim Costello, who's currently working with World Vision, has been their CEO, but he was the mayor of St Kilda, he was running a legal practice in St Kilda, and he was the pastor of the church at St Kilda Baptist. And he had a vision to see St Kilda transformed. And the main thing that I got out of this book that Tim wrote was that if we want to change society, we've got to tell a different story. And today we embark on a 4-week series called The Single Thing That Can Change the World. It's actually based on a book, a short book, and we've run out of them. But you can go to the Baptist World Aid website and get an ebook. It is an unbelievably challenging book. And we're going to be using some of what Scott Higgins says in this book and some of the resources that he developed as we go through this series. You know, one of the things that parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles love to do with their kids is to tell stories, and children love stories. Recently I was in Canada for a conference, and I met up with a couple who used to be part of Syndal, and they've now got a little girl, and they came and we shared a meal together, and during the meal I started to tell a story or two to this little girl. And she just kept saying, tell me more stories. And I could only think of gruesome stories after that. And the mother asked me to stop telling such gruesome stories. But kids love stories, and good children's stories have some great insights and some profound truths. When our 4 kids were small, someone who was a significant part of our family life, gave them this book, The Velveteen Rabbit. How many of you have read it? Okay, a number. If you haven't read it, it's worth a read. I read it again yesterday and got quite inspired by it. But in this book, the central character is a rabbit who's given to a young boy, and the rabbit soon discovers that the ambition of every toy in the nursery is to become real. But the Velveteen Rabbit doesn't know what that means or how it happens. So he asks the oldest and wisest toy in the nursery, the old skin horse, what's real? Real isn't how you're made, said the skin horse. It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real. Does it happen all at once, like being wound up, he asked, or bit by bit? Doesn't happen all at once, said the skin horse. You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't often happen to people who break easily or have sharp edges or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you're real, most of your hair has been loved off. And your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you're real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. You know, it's not only toys in an imaginary story that want to be made real, but every human being wants to be made real. Deep down inside every human being, there's a desire to be loved intensely, so intimately that you can become real. The sort of love that brings to life. I've been blessed to experience this sort of love, a love that's big and generous, a love that washes over you, seeps down into you. I received it from my mum and dad. I received it from my wife Jenny, from my kids, my grandkids, my extended family, my friends. This church has loved me extravagantly, but I've got it mostly from God. And at the heart of the Christian worldview is the idea that we are valuable and worthwhile, and that there is a design for our lives, a design to worship our Creator and find hope and meaning in our Creator that reflects the character and values and mission of God, that we shape our world to reflect the compassion and the justice of God in the world. The Christian worldview sees reality, being real, as guided and enabled by a God of love. Now, not everyone sees it that way, and perhaps the most outspoken and famous person who sees it in a different way is a guy called Richard Dawkins. And there's a quote that's going to go up on the screen. It says, "In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at the bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." And I reckon anyone who has suffered can perhaps sympathise with Dawkins. Anyone who's lost loved ones or suffered through tsunamis or fire or flood or drought or cancer might sympathise with Dawkins. But the question is, do we see pain and suffering as a sign that God doesn't exist? Or that our world is fractured and broken and in need of repair by a loving God? Have your longings or my longings for beauty and justice and love come through evolution, or are they rumours of another reality, an echo of a beautiful God? You know, into this world of challenge and suffering and struggle came a person of whom it was said, all the fullness of God lived in him. He was full of grace and truth. He made God known to human beings. He's the one through whom we discover that the centre of reality is a God of extravagant, generous love who offers abundant life, and his desire is to help us flourish in life. You know, Jesus' favourite image of God was that of Father. In Jesus' time on earth, he lived in a patriarchal society in which the image of Father was one of an authoritative leader in the household. But Jesus gives us a whole new meaning of the picture of God as Father, one that welcomes us, one that includes us in his family, one that declares that God's heart is toward us, one that he is connected to us with a love that cannot be quenched, even if we refuse to accept it. Does that blow your mind? His love for us cannot be quenched, even if we refuse to accept it. A God that provides generously for us. A God that longs for a relationship with us. And we see this beautifully expressed in numbers of stories about Jesus, but maybe it's best expressed in Jesus' story that we find in Luke 15. A story that's really familiar. It's called The Prodigal Son. And we've talked about it over the years, but we do well to revisit it again and again. The setting for the story is rural Galilee, where the vast majority of the population were farmers and households were multi-generational, which meant that there were always family members to work the farm and work the land, and so provide for the old and frail. It was also a society that really valued honour, and especially honouring your parents. So let's read from Luke 15, verses 11 and 12. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided the property between them. This request in village society can only mean that the younger son was impatient for the dad to die. Not good, is it? But if the dad died, his property could be distributed and divided between the sons. Only rarely would a dad divide the inheritance up before he died, and if he did, the son would be given the legal right of possession, but while the father was alive, he would still control what happened there. However, culture in the Middle East tells us that this would never happen. No son would do this, ask for the inheritance before his dad had died, and if he did, his father would probably beat him because he wanted his dad to die. This request from the younger son tells us some things about 3 characters in the story. The first is that the younger son was entitled to 1/3 of the inheritance. In Jewish society, the older son would get 2/3 and the younger son would get 1/3 if there were 2 children. So the younger son is not breaking a law, but he is breaking a relationship. He's selfishly demanding his right without regard for anyone else in the family. You see, the wealth of a village family was not made up of savings and shares, but it was made up of buildings and animals and perhaps land. And to suddenly lose 1/3 would mean a staggering loss to the extended family. Property and stock would need to be sold, and to sell in a hurry would be to sell cheaply. It seems that the younger son is indifferent to this and seemingly ungrateful for the way that his dad has loved him. It's interesting that the younger son doesn't actually ask for 1/3 of the inheritance. He avoids that word because if he'd used that word, it would mean that he'd have to accept some leadership responsibility in the family and to keep help building the family. Rather, he asked for his share of the property. He wanted to cash it in. And he did this knowing that it would break fellowship with his father and cut himself off from his roots and his family. You know, in the Middle East, people don't ask, "What do you do in life?" They ask, "Where are you from? What household are you from? Tell us about your family." And the scorn and the ridicule of the entire community would have been considerable. What this boy did was reprehensible. The older son mentioned that the dad had 2 sons. The older son would normally be a mediator in such a circumstance between the father and the son. Even if the older son hated his brother, for the sake of his dad, the older son would seek to mediate, but we hear nothing from him in this part of the story. Perhaps there's a broken relationship between the boys as well. And maybe the older brother is secretly happy that the younger son is going to go away. The third character is the father. And he does what no village father would ever do. He says yes and grants the request. The expected reaction would be refusal and punishment. But like God, the father grants freedom. Freedom even to reject his love. Fellowship, relationship with the dad may be broken on the son's part, but the dad remains the dad and he does not sever the relationship with his son. In that culture, if a son broke a relationship like this, often what would happen would be that there would be a jar and the jar would be smashed on the ground, and so the whole community knows that at the smashing of the jar, it was a way of saying, "You are no longer my son." But the dad doesn't do that. Rather, he suffers. And his suffering provides the foundation for the possibility of his younger son returning. Both sons get their share. The younger son a third, the older son gets 2/3. But the dad remains in control of the property, although he's granted the legal right to his kids. Let's keep reading. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I'll set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer to be worthy to be called your son, so make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went to his father. The bridges for the younger son are now burnt. He travels away from his own people. We're not told exactly what he did, other than blow all of his money in wild living. He had nothing left. He was in need. At wit's end, the text says he joined himself, or the word is so strong, it says he clung to a pig farmer. And the word that's used here could imply that the pig farmer didn't want to employ him, but this guy so badgered him for a job that to shut him up, he gave him the job. You could tell he was desperate, because Jews were supposed to have nothing to do with pigs. He was a wealthy person and foolishly lost all his money. So desperate was he that he even longed for the pig food. They were better off than he was. Now, we're not sure whether the word means he was too weak to compete with the pigs for the food, or whether he longs to be a pig to be able to digest the food that they were eating. But finally he came to his senses and he repents. He changes his mind about his situation and what needs to be done. And it's though he declares, "That's enough. I've had it. No more nights with the pigs. I'm going home. Even the people my dad hires as day labourers are better off than me. They don't work to make a living. They work to have bread to eat, and they're better off than me." He wasn't talking servants of his father. He was talking about people that were hired for the day from the village square. They weren't the father's servants. They were the hired people from the village square for the day. They had more security than he had. He hopes his dad will accept him. And so he starts to prepare his little speech. He acknowledges that he's done wrong and he's willing to be a day labourer for his dad. That would mean he wouldn't be able to live at home, but he would be available to be hired through the day. He doesn't even mention reconciliation. He wants bread to eat, and perhaps he can start to redeem himself through honourable work. He knows that there'll be a lot of contempt when he gets back home from the people of the village. And there's every likelihood that he's going to be shunned. We read on. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And so they began to celebrate. You know, things don't quite go as this son planned. The village knows that the boy is in disgrace, and people would expect a dad to remain aloof and distant. It would be some time before the son was even allowed to see the dad, and his dad would summon him at the appropriate time to come. Quite likely there'd be some punishment that would be meted out so that the honour of the family would be maintained. However, something really different happens. The dad does what no Jewish dad would normally do. He's been looking for the boy ever since he left. And when he sees him, he runs. In fact, the word is, he races to embrace the son and kiss him. You know, a man of his position and his age always walks in a slow, dignified fashion. He's not run anywhere for any purpose for maybe 40 years. No villager over the age of 30 ever runs. And to race down the road, he needs to take the front edge of his robe in his hands, and in doing so would reveal his undergarments. That's a shameful thing to do in that culture, and especially in front of people in the street who would more than likely be tormenting his son as the son came back. And yet the running of the dad would distract the people from the son and would have the effect of taking upon the dad the shame and the humiliation that belonged to his son. In doing so, he picks up what the son should have experienced. The villagers may well have run with him, and when they do, they can't believe what they hear in the conversation. What the father does, he does to restore the boy not just to the family, but to the entire community. Have a look at some key words and actions. This passage says that the dad was moved with compassion. The word means he was moved in the depth of his being, in his guts, in his bowels. That's the strength of the word. You know, the son may have wandered away, but he never ceased to be the father's son. The father may have been angered by the harm the son perpetrated, disappointed at the choices he made, but not for a minute did the dad stop longing for the son to come home. It says that he kissed the son again and again. The father had suffered intensely for a long time and now unreservedly welcomes his son. It says the boy acknowledges what he'd done and is about to ask to be a day labourer. But his dad breaks in and says to the servants, "Dress him as a son. Bring the best robe. Give him a signet ring, for he will have some authority in managing the family fortune." Like, how galling would that be for the older brother? And the dad says, "Give him some shoes. He's my son." Then he says, "Kill the fattened calf." Enough not just for the family, but for the community. The dad was restoring this boy publicly and honouring him before the whole village. Wow. This dad, like Jesus, not only accepts and welcomes sinners with open arms, he not only eats with them, but he kills the fattened calf. And it says this dead boy is alive again to the father's love and a relationship with the dad. The final segment. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed any orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you're always with me. Everything that I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." This family was wealthy. They own property. They have a calf being fattened for any important event that would require a banquet. They have servants. And no landowner with servants would do manual work. So the older son has most likely not been working, but sitting in the shade, out in the fields, managing the work of all of the other servants. As he returns, he hears music and dancing. And he summons a young boy. The text says servant in English, but the word is a young boy. In those days, the adults would be in experiencing the banqueting and the dancing and the food, and there'd be young people, guys and girls, out in the courtyard. And it says that this older brother asks a young boy and says, "What's going on in there?" And he hears that his brother has come home and had been welcomed and honoured by his dad. He's furious. Everything left in the house is legally his, although the father still maintains authority. The fattened calf, the butchered calf, is his. But there's another thing. At such a banquet, the father sits with the guests, and the elder son is expected to stand and serve all through the banquet as the head waiter. It's like saying to the guests, "You are so important that our sons will look after you." But what complicates it is that the younger son is the honoured guest. The thought of serving his brother is terrible, and especially because he's been reinstated without penalty. The family's been dishonoured in the community by the younger son, and if the father thinks he's going to make a fool of himself, that's one thing, but not me, says the older brother. And at a banquet like this, it's expected that the male members of the household would come and greet the guests, and for the elder son not to do that is insulting to the guests and insulting to his dad. Word of the son's refusal reaches his father, and everyone else will know as well. And for the second time in one day, the dad does a remarkable thing. He demonstrates a willingness to endure shame to enable reconciliation. Shock would have echoed through the banquet hall as the dad goes out for the second time that day. He loves both of his sons extravagantly and indiscriminately. He goes out to appeal to his son, to stand alongside him, not facing him and opposing him, but standing with him to try and help him see his perspective. The son refuses and unleashes a tirade on his dad. He doesn't even address his dad as dad. He sees his relationship as a slave, not as a son. He calls his brother your son. He accuses his brother of things that may not be true. You can tell he's not happy. What will his dad do? And remember that this conversation would not be private either. The dad starts with, "My son." He bypasses the fact that this son had omitted his title. He bypasses the fact that there was bitterness and distortion and criticism and sarcasm, and instead he pours out love on his son. And the word for son here that he uses is not the ordinary word, but one that indicates deep love and affection. He gently reminds him that the prodigal is his brother, and he reminds him that everything that the father has belongs to the elder son, and then he defends the joy of the celebration. That's it. But how does the story end? Jesus doesn't finish the story. He wants you to finish the story. And he wants me to finish the story. But he knows that for acting the same way as the dad, he'll get crucified for it. At other times, Jesus spoke outrageously about not only loving a child, but loving neighbours, even those that others despise. He spoke more than that about loving enemies, just like God does. I don't really know what it's like to have an enemy. I have people who disagree with me and annoyed with me, and people I disappoint, frustrate. I don't feel like I've got many enemies. If you're one, you better tell me. But these people that Jesus was talking to had enemies. They were living in occupied territory. They were a people that had been wounded deeply. They longed for justice, which they thought would come through retribution. But retribution doesn't break the cycle of hatred and violence. Retribution can't turn an enemy into a friend. It can't create better communities. Jesus called people to return cruelty with kindness, harm with forgiveness, to advocate for those without a voice, to give one's life for God's mission. He lived out what he taught, and on the cross he cried out, "Father, forgive." No matter what happened to him, he loved and showed grace. Recently I was travelling to and from Canada, and as reading on the plane, I read this book. It's called From Genocide to Generosity. It has some amazing stories, story after story of what happened in Rwanda when the rest of the world cast a blind eye to what was happening. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were slaughtered. And this book talks about opportunities where people whose families had been murdered and raped would get together and encounter those who'd done the atrocities. I tell you what, this book would do a lot for a lot of people in our society to learn how that generosity is actually a way better way to respond than retribution. Acting like God does. The single thing that can change the world is an ambitious title for the book, for the series. There are many things that can change our world, aren't there? There are many things that can change daily in our world, but this series is about the incredible news that at the centre of reality is a God who is filled with a generous love for us and for all creation. He's passionate about us. He longs for us. He pursues our well-being. He wants us to flourish, and this is the greatest discovery that you will ever make. Imagine if you would allow this news to sink deep into your psyche. Imagine if we would allow the Spirit of God to fill our lives and flood our lives so that the love of God does a transforming work in us and through us. If that was the case, we'll celebrate what's good. We will grieve over what mars and diminishes and destroys. We'll accept God's invitation to partner with him in his mission. We don't live in a world where God is absent or pitilessly indifferent. Rather, we live in a world where God stands with arms open wide, welcoming us home, reminding us that there is room at his table for everyone, and helping us and all people live into what it means to be his daughter or his son. I'm not sure where you are at tonight, but if there's nothing else that you take away from this service tonight, go knowing that you are unbelievably loved and nothing can quench the love that God has for you. A love that will heal wounds. A love that will guide and navigate through really tricky situations. A love that will enable you to flourish in whatever it is that he's shaped you to be and to do. In this little book, Scott Higgins gives an exercise at the end of each of the 4 weeks. And the one for this week, you'll see it on the screen. Build a sense of God's generous love by practicing gratitude and celebration. Each day, identify 1 or 2 things for which you are thankful. Write them down, put them where you will see them, maybe a sticky note on your mirror, fridge, in your diary, on your dashboard, wherever it is. I dare you to do it. And then find a way during the week to celebrate the things for which you're thankful. I know that many of us here tonight are really thankful for the fact that Jesus good news has been something that has transformed our lives. But if you're here tonight and you say, I don't even know much about Jesus, but if he's anything like that dad, I wouldn't mind getting to know him. We'd love to talk with you about how to do that. He longs for a relationship with you, and his commitment is to help you flourish in life. He came to give you life. If you want to talk with anyone about it afterwards, we would love to talk with you about it. If you'd like to pray with someone afterwards, one of the best ways to actually receive the love of God is to open our lives up and simply say, Lord Jesus, thank you for what you've done, for who you are. It's hard to believe that you would love me even despite what you know about me. But thank you that you do. Please forgive me, fill me fresh with your Spirit, and be the Lord of my life. And we can do that in a prayer time together. There might be something special in your life at the moment that you need his special love to seep deep into you and unlock something that's going on for you. Our final song tonight is called Good, Good Father. He's a good, good father. And I want to encourage you to use this song as a response song. I'm not going to ask you to come forward or anything like that, but in your own heart, you might want to respond and say, thank you. I want to respond to you like the Father that we've just read about in the Bible. Let's pray, and then the team will come and lead us. Our God, we thank you that you're a good, good Father. Thank you that that's who you are. You can't be anything different. And thank you that you've demonstrated that amazing grace that treats us according to our needs and not according to what we deserve when you sent Jesus. Lord, I pray that for anyone here tonight who has never yet opened their life to you, that you'll give them the courage to explore that further and to take that step. And Lord, for those of us who are here and we know that our lives not aligned, maybe we identify with the younger brother, or maybe we identify with the older brother. Thanks that you came out to each, that you love us indiscriminately, unconditionally, and extravagantly generously. Give us the courage to respond to that love, we pray. In the name of Jesus. Amen.